I'd like to begin today by reviewing some of the information that you read from the excerpts of Herodotus. Last week I mentioned that Herodotus was a Greek historian who lived about 450 BC. He visited Egypt and he wrote down his observations while he was there, but he also wrote down some of the history of Egypt that was related to him by the priests who were touring him around. One of the stories that he related was that when Pharaoh Psemtek III was in power, that he decided to conduct an experiment. Herodotus explains that the Egyptians were in the habit of thinking of themselves being a little bit better than everybody else, and so they believed that they were the first humans that were created. Pharaoh Psemtek wanted to prove this, and so he decided to do an experiment where he recruited the babies of a commoner, and he asked a shepherd to feed them. Shepherd seemed like a good person to choose. He would have access to milk to feed the infants, and the shepherd was instructed never to speak to the children, just to take care of their physical needs. So the story goes that when the children were about 2 years old, the shepherd comes in to minister to the children, and they run to him with their arms outstretched, saying, "Bekos, Bekos." He eventually tells Pharaoh Psemtek what is going on. Pharaoh Psemtek has the children brought into his presence, and they continue to ask for Bekos, and he does a search, and he learns that the Phrygians have a word similar to Bekos, which means bread, and so it makes sense that the children would be crying for bread. Phrygia is actually a little bit north of Egypt, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, in the area at the time that was called Anatolia and now is called Turkey. Psemtek wasn't the only person in history who decided to do a language deprivation experiment. History records that it happened at least 4 times, first with Pharaoh Psemtek, but it also records that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the 1200s decided to do a similar experiment. We don't know whether he was familiar with what Herodotus say or if he came up with it on his own. He wanted to see what the natural language of somebody was, what language they would have spoken in Eden, and so it seemed to him a good idea to have some young children raised without being spoken to, so that when they got old enough to start speaking, he could discover what language Adam and Eve would have spoken. Frederick apparently told the foster mothers to nurse the children and to bathe them, but not to talk with them or play with them, and it was his hope that they would end up speaking Hebrew or something like that. Although he also thought it would be a possibility that they spoke Greek or Latin or even Arabic. According to a monk who wrote the chronicles of Emperor Frederick II, Frederick never learned what language they would have spoken naturally, because without human interaction, the children ended up dying. James IV of Scotland is also said to have sent 2 children to be raised by a mute woman, isolated on an island, to determine what language that they would learn, and the children were reported to have started speaking Hebrew, but most historians think that that probably isn't true. And then the 4th time in history where this was attempted was by the Mughal Emperor Akbar, who had children raised by mute wet nurses. Akbar actually learned that when children are raised without hearing human speech, that they actually never learn to talk. Herodotus also discussed the Egyptian calendar. Unlike most ancient calendars, the Egyptian calendar was a solar calendar with a 365-day year. The Egyptians broke the year up into 3 seasons, each with 120 days, and each season was broken into 4 30-day months. The months were further broken down into 3 10-day weeks, and at a certain point in Egyptian history, they developed the custom of taking a 2-day weekend. So they would work for 8 days and then take off for 2 days. Akhet was the flood season. And here we see the hieroglyph for the word Akhet, or flood. To say that it was the first season of Akhet, they would have added a sliver of a moon with the number 1 under it. And the other months of Akhet would have been written similarly. The first month of Akhet, the second month of Akhet, third month of Akhet, and the fourth month of Akhet. Now, the first month of Akhet ran from about mid-July to mid-August. The second month ran from mid-August to mid-September. The third month would have ran from about mid-September to mid-October. And the fourth month of Akhet would have ran from mid-October to mid-November. The sowing season was called Peret. Here we see the hieroglyph for Peret, and the months of Peret would have been built the same way as the months of Akhet. The first month of Peret ran from mid-November to mid-December. The second month ran from mid-December to mid-January. The third month ran from mid-January to mid-February. And the fourth month ran from mid-February to mid-March. So it would have taken place at the same time that we associate winter. Obviously, if they were sowing and the plants were growing, it wouldn't have been winter weather there. And finally, we had the harvest season, or Shumu. Once again, we have the hieroglyph for Shumu, and we build the names of the month the same way. The first month would have ran from mid-March to mid-April, the second month from April to May, the third month of Shumu from May to June, and finally the fourth month of Shumu from mid-June to mid-July. At the end of their solar calendar year, they had 5 days left over, and you read about that in your reading from Tales of Ancient Egypt this week, and we'll go over that in just a moment. The 5 days were considered to be holy days. They weren't part of any month. They weren't part of any season. They weren't part of the actual year. They were just 5 holy days set apart. Herodotus also discussed things that he observed in Egypt that were very different than back in his native Greece. And he blames the differences on the way that the Nile River runs. Remember that the Nile runs from the mountains in the south down to the lower area in the north, and most rivers do run from north to south rather than south to north. And so Herodotus considered that backwards and reasoned that because the river ran backwards that the Egyptians did things backwards. And so one thing that he points out is that the Egyptians wove from bottom to top, meanwhile the Greeks wove from top to bottom. He also mentions that the Egyptian priests are always male priests. Now, I know that at certain times in Egyptian history there were priestesses. I'm assuming, though, that at the time that Herodotus visited Egypt, that somehow that custom had fallen out of favor. Nevertheless, he observed that when he was in Egypt, he only saw male priests. He mentioned that the priests shaved their head, and we have a picture here of a priest with his leopard skin, so he's obviously a priest, and he has hair on his head. Quite possibly it is just a wig. According to Herodotus, the priests that he saw had shaved heads. In Greece, there were indeed priestesses for each of the female gods, and the priests had full heads of hair. They didn't shave their head. Another observation he made was that we read Greek from left to right, and his observation was that you read Egyptian from right to left. Egyptologists tell us that actually you could read Egyptian 3 different ways, from right to left, but also from left to right and top to bottom. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Egyptians actually used several different scripts to write with. Hieroglyphics were the sacred carvings, and hieroglyph is actually a Greek word that means just that, sacred carving. But they also could use a form of writing called hieratic. It was like the quick version of hieroglyphs. Instead of drawing a whole bird, you might draw its head and its tail feathers. Then there was also demotic, another Greek word used by Herodotus that meant demos, the people's writing. So demotic was the people's writing. It was a much quicker script. And the fourth way that they could write things down was what we call Coptic. The Copts were Egyptian Christians, and rather than use the form of writing that was associated with the Egyptian temples, they wrote down Egyptian words using Greek letters. Here we see the Rosetta Stone, and you probably already know that the Rosetta Stone was the key to discovering how to read hieroglyphs. It was found during the French occupation of Egypt under Napoleon Bonaparte, and it is a stela with words written in Greek, hieroglyph, and demotic. Before they discovered the Rosetta Stone, it had been suggested by scholars that the ovals that they called cartouches contained the names of kings or gods, important people. And after the Rosetta Stone was found, an Englishman named Thomas Young was trying to decipher it because they could read what the Greeks said, and they assumed that the other two scripts was a copy of what the Greeks said. And so he was using it to try and figure out ancient hieroglyphs and the demotic. Before the time of Thomas Young, scholars looked at the pictures and they assumed that the picture writing was what we call ideographs. In other words, if you are trying to write about the sun, you would just draw a picture of the sun. And if you were trying to write about a house, you would just draw a picture of a house. Now, Thomas Young started thinking about this, and it seemed to him that it would be very difficult to write names using picture writing. And so he proposed the idea that the pictures were actually letters of an alphabet. Unfortunately, his research stalled because he could figure out how the word sounded, but he couldn't figure out what the meanings of the word were beyond, of course, the name Ptolemy. His research was picked up by a Frenchman named Jean-Francois Champollion, who understood Coptic. Now, Coptic is the closest language that we have to ancient Egyptian, and Champollion had taught himself several different languages by the time he was age 15. He was a very, very smart man, and he was able to take Young's ideas and decipher what the hieroglyphics meant on the Rosetta Stone by figuring them out phonetically and then saying the words out loud and comparing the sounds to Coptic words. And it took him about 20 years to figure out what the Rosetta Stone actually said. Before we move on, I'd like you to turn to this page in your homework, and we're going to talk just a little bit about hieroglyphs. Now, hieroglyphs can be used three different ways. They can be used phonetically, like our ABCs. And you see the picture here, there's a picture of a hand, which makes the sound D. There's a picture of a rectangle, which makes the sound P. And there's a half circle there, which makes the sound T. So we have D, P, T, dupt. And in Egyptian, that meant boat. So if you wanted to write the word boat, you would draw a picture of a hand, a picture of a rectangle, and a half circle, dupt, or boat. Now, the second way that you can use hieroglyphs is as what we call a determinant. For example, if you want to make sure that people understood that you were writing the word boat, you could draw a little picture of a boat because it helped determine what the meaning of the letters were. And the third way that you could use hieroglyphs was what they originally thought they were, as an ideogram. And sometimes they do use the hieroglyphs as an ideogram. For example, you might have a picture of a man or a picture of a woman. In order to distinguish between this being an alphabetic use or determinate use of a hieroglyph, you would draw a little line underneath the man and a little line underneath the woman to say, that's all you get. This is just to tell you, I'm talking about a man, I'm talking about a woman. Let's go ahead and do one more. Here is a picture of a duck, and we're going to draw a line underneath the duck. And the duck literally meant sun. And so whenever you see in hieroglyphs a little picture of a duck with a line underneath it, it means sun. And here we have an example of the hieroglyphic alphabet. Herodotus also wrote about crocodiles. Remember that people back in Greece would never have even seen a crocodile, so it would have been interesting for them to read about. The Egyptians, as you recall, did have a crocodile god named Sebek, and many Egyptians held crocodiles to be sacred. And when they died, they would mummify them. But as Herodotus points out, there were others who saw crocodiles as a pest and would kill them. Herodotus found the Egyptian way of embalming the dead to be very strange and very different. In the ancient Greek culture, funerals usually involved dressing up the body and placing a coin on their lips. The coin was meant to be an offering to pay the fare on the way to the underworld as you crossed the river Styx. Now, they would mourn the dead, and they usually had a funeral procession. They might even have paid mourners to make it a bigger procession. And then at that point, either the body was buried or was put into a tomb-like structure. Sometimes the body was even burned. So for the Greeks, there was no preservation of the body. There was no expectation that your physical body would be preserved for eternity. If you were buried, if you were put into a tomb, they knew that your body was going to decay. And if you were cremated, then they might collect your ashes and put it into a nice urn, but your physical body wasn't present anymore. Meanwhile, as you know, the Egyptians were very careful to embalm and wrap the bodies of the dead to preserve them. In their religion, they believed that the only way that you could continue to have eternal life was for your physical body to continue to exist. Mummies were placed into coffins that were form-fitting, and I think it's interesting that Herodotus says then they are just kind of leaned up against the wall, just standing, and certainly that was something that they could do with a mummy case. Remember that as part of the embalming process, certain organs were considered to be important, and so they were taken out and embalmed separately and put into what we call canopic jars. And each of these parts of the body were watched over by one of Osiris's sons. Herodotus must have been there during the inundation, or the flooding season, and so he mentions that during the flood season, only the very highest ground in the cities was actually dry land. In fact, he mentions that they seem like islands of their own surrounded by water, and that areas that normally people would be walking in have now become waterways, and so they use boats to go every place, from high ground to high ground. This is a photograph that was taken before they started putting dams and locks in along the Nile River to control the flooding. And so you can see that this is the area near the Great Pyramids, and it is just totally flooded, and the high ground comes out like little islands. This past week in your reading through Tales of Ancient Egypt, you got a background in Egyptian mythology. You read about the sun god Ra, and how from the mists of the night, a creature that they called Apophis, an evil creature, formed and eventually entered the hearts of men, and how men began to rebel against Ra. As a punishment, he created the goddess Sekhmet, whose job it was to devour those who were rebelling against Ra. Unfortunately, she enjoyed her job a little too much, and so she went beyond simply punishing those who were rebelling against Ra, and she became a wanton killer. You read that in order to stop her from killing all of mankind, that he tricked Sekhmet into drinking beer that was colored with ochre to look like human blood, and he transformed Sekhmet into the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love. And if you recall, he quipped that love was a punishment in and of itself. You also read the story of the goddess Nut, who wanted to have children, and because of a prophecy, Ra cursed her to not be able to give birth to any children on any day of the year. She turned to the god of wisdom, Tot, And if you recall, he gambled with the god of the moon, Khonsu, for enough light to create 5 more days. And she was able to give birth to 5 children. The 5 children of Nut were Osiris, Harmachis, Isis, Nephthys, and Set. And Isis became the wife of Osiris, while Nephthys became the wife of Set. You also read about Horus and Anubis. Horus was the son of Isis and Osiris, while Anubis was the son of Nephthys and Set. Hathor became Horus's wife, at least in some versions of the mythology, while Anubis was married to a goddess who, like him, had the head of a jackal, and her name was Anputand. Sometimes that was shortened down to Anpu. And finally, you read a story about Pharaoh Zoser, and according to the Egyptians, Egypt under Zoser was experiencing a 7-year famine. He turned to his vizier, Imhotep, for advice about how to end the famine, and Imhotep told him that the reason that they were having a famine was because Zoser was neglecting Khnemu, the god of the Nile. Once Zoser learned this, he was able to honor Khnemu, and that ended the 7-year famine. Remember that ancient Egyptian history was divided into 3 major periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, and that in between we have 2 intermediate periods. This past week you read about the Middle Kingdom, and also you read some about the second intermediate period, which would have been the time when the Hyksos took over the Nile Delta region. The Middle Kingdom was primarily ruled over by kings who were members of Egypt's 12th dynasty. The first king of the 12th dynasty was a man named Amenemhat, who became, of course, Amenemhat I. Scholars think that he was the vizier under Mentuhotep IV, who was the last pharaoh of the 11th dynasty. Amenemhat was not of royal lineage. However, his parents were part of the Egyptian nobility. They were nomarchs in one of Egypt's province. A nomarch would have been like a royal governor. Archaeologists have found a scroll that they call the Prophecy of Neferti that they think may have been written during the time of Amenemhat I in order to legitimize his claim to the throne. The Prophecy of Neferti is written like a fictional story, but it was purported at the time to have been true. It takes place in the court of King Sneferu, who ruled Egypt during the 4th dynasty, and Neferti is summoned to the court so that he can entertain the king with speeches, and then he's asked to speak of the future rather than to speak of the past, and so they record this prophecy that Neferti gives. And basically it says that there will be a king from the south whose name will be Ameni, true of voice in his name. He is the son of a woman of the land of the bow. He is a child of the heartland. He will take up the white crown, and he will raise up the red crown, and he will unite the 2 mighty goddesses. He will appease the 2 lord gods with what they desire, the field circuit in his grasp, the oar in the jump. Ameni would be like a short version of Amenemhat, and so, like I said, this papyrus exists, and scholars think that it was probably written after Amenemhat became king in order to legitimize his rule. Hey, of course he should be the next king. It was prophesied hundreds of years ago that he would be the king someday, and he would unite Upper and Lower Egypt again. Now, the reign of Amenemhat I must have been somewhat tenuous, because in the 20th year of his reign, he made his son Sesostris co-regent. In other words, he's ruling along with his father. And so for the last 10 years of Amenemhet's rule, he and his son are ruling together. In fact, they had a stela carved, letting the people know that we are both now the king of Egypt. This was probably a good move on Amenemhet's part, because 10 years after his son has been reigning with him, he sends his son on an expedition into Libya to try and gain more influence in that part of Africa. And while his son is away, scholars believe that he was murdered. His son comes back and becomes king. And as a way to honor his father, Sesostris has one of the court scribes write some wisdom literature that archaeologists call the Instructions of Amenemhet. It's basically advice about how to lead a country. And so within it, we read things like, beware of the subjects who are nobodies. Beware of those who are plotting that you're not aware of. Don't trust your brother. Don't have any friends. And in it, Amenemhet says, I gave to beggars, I helped the poor. And look at what happened to me. I gave myrrh to people, and they didn't help me. But he who ate my food raised opposition. He whom I trusted plotted against me. He even tells how he was killed. He says that after supper, during the night, weapons that should have been used for my protection were turned against me. I had assigned order to everything. Life was good, and look what happened. So from here on out in the 12th dynasty, the names of the rulers kind of flip back and forth between Amenemhet and Sesostris. Amenemhet the first, Sesostris the first, Amenemhet the second, Sesostris the second, and so on down. Amenemhet the fourth was the last real king of the 12th dynasty, and we actually don't know much about him. The dynasty ends with a queen who rules for a few years, and then that is the end, and Egypt moves on to the 13th and the 14th dynasty and into what's called the Second Intermediate Period. The 13th and the 14th dynasty actually occurred at the same time. One primarily ruled in the north, the other primarily ruled in the south. And during that time, Lower Egypt was taken over by a group that the Egyptians called the Hyksos. And the Hyksos make up what we call the 15th dynasty. Their rulers were rulers of the 15th dynasty. Hyksos was not an actual title that the rulers used. It's just a term that was used by native Egyptians. And at first, archaeologists thought that the term meant shepherd kings, but a better translation is now available. And Hyksos actually comes from two Egyptian words, Hakel Kasut. Here we see the hieroglyph for Hyksos. Notice that there is a crook symbol. The crook is a symbol of authority and of ruling. And then we also have hills and mountains, which are symbols of distant lands. You would translate that probably foreign. Above the crook and the hills is a single mountain. It's considered to be a determinate hieroglyph that emphasizes the foreignness of the kings, and so the translation would be foreign kings rather than shepherd kings. Historians are not sure how long the Hyksos ruled. They estimate that they were in Egypt for about 100 years. They didn't leave a lot of records behind, so historians aren't even exactly sure who they were. They're assumed to be from the area of Palestine just because of the way that they were dressed. But recently they have found some lovely frescoes that date from the Hyksos period, and the artwork actually looks more like Cretan artwork than it does like Egyptian artwork, and so that's an interesting development. The only ancient account of the Hyksos period comes from Manetho, who was an Egyptian historian. And Manetho says that the Hyksos were a people of ignoble origin from the east, whose coming was unforeseen. They had the audacity to invade the country, which they mastered by main force without difficulty or even battle. Having overpowered the chiefs, they then savagely burnt the cities, razed the temples of the gods to the ground, and treated the whole native population with utmost cruelty, massacring some and carrying off the wives and the children of others into slavery. Most historians, though, despite what Manetho says, believe that the Hyksos had actually been in the Nile Delta area for over 150 years before they took over, and that them coming into power and starting the 15th dynasty was probably a lot more peaceful than Manetho remembered. Some differences between them and the Egyptians were that they worshipped the god Set, and most Egyptians, most native-born Egyptians, would have despised the god Set, and they also worshipped the Canaanite storm god Baal. During the time of the Hyksos, the 16th and 17th dynasties continued to rule Upper Egypt to the south, and a 17th dynasty king eventually expelled the Hyksos, and it began with a letter from the Hyksos king Apophis to the prince of Thebes, Sekenenra Tau II, and basically it said, "The hippopotami in your pools are keeping me awake at night. They have to be silenced." Keep in mind that the capital city of the Hyksos was a city called Avaris, which was 500 miles to the north of the southern kingdom of Thebes. Sekenenra ends up gathering an army and marching north, but unfortunately he ends up being killed during that battle. His son, Kamos, however, goes ahead and to avenge his father, goes on a campaign, and he's able to capture several of the cities that were loyal to the Hyksos. Kamos puts the city of Avaris, which was a walled city, under siege, and he defeated the city after capturing a messenger that had been sent out by Apophis trying to get the Nubians, the south, to come to his aid. Apophis wrote, "Send troops, and we will divide Egypt between us." Unfortunately, Kamos appears to have died soon afterwards, and he's considered to be the last king of the 17th dynasty. However, Kamos has a brother, and his brother Amos continues the fight, and he eventually expels the Hyksos out of Egypt. In fact, he sets up a stela saying that he chased them all the way to Palestine. Amos founded the 18th dynasty, and once again he is ruling over a united Egypt. This next week you're going to be reading several kinds of Egyptian literature, and so I wanted to go over the kinds of genres or the major subjects that we'll be covering. So if you'll turn back to this page, we'll get that section filled in. Like literature from Mesopotamia, Egyptian literature falls into several genres. First, we're going to be talking about myths. Myths are stories about how the world came to be and acts of the gods. The Egyptians also wrote narrative tales. Narratives are stories that are made to entertain. In fact, historians refer to there being a literary explosion that occurred during the New Kingdom. They also wrote examples of devotional literature, hymns and prayers. They wrote wisdom literature. Remember that wisdom literature includes teachings and instructions and discourses and proverbs, observations about certain occupations, and observations about how to behave properly. The Egyptians also included scientific writing, observations about the world and mathematics and medical texts. In fact, they have lots of medical texts. And then finally, biographies and memorials. That would be acts of the kings and other great men of Egypt. And these are usually found in tombs. They're usually funerary texts. In our last few minutes together today, I thought that we would quickly go over the hymn of the Nile. And your pre-reading activity says, although the Egyptians did not worship the Nile like they worshipped other gods, they did view the Nile as a force that brought fertility to their land and abundance. So we're going to read the hymn of the Nile together, and then we're going to answer the questions. And it says, "Hail to thee, O Nile, who manifests yourself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt. Mysterious is thy issuing forth from the darkness on this day whereon it is celebrated, watering the orchards created by Ra to cause all the cattle to live. You give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one, path that descends from the sky, loving the bread of Geb, and the first fruits of Nepera. You cause the workshop of Ta to prosper. Lord of the fish, during the inundation no bird alights on the crops. You create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring eternity to the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish. If the gods suffer in heaven, then the faces of men waste away. Then he torments the flocks of Egypt, and great and small are in agony. But all is changed for mankind when he comes. He is endowed with the qualities of noon. If he shines, the earth is joyous. Every stomach is full of rejoicing. Every spine is happy. Every jawbone crushes its food. He brings the offerings as chief of provisioning. He is the creator of all good things. the master of energy, full of sweetness in his choice. If offerings are made, it is thanks to him. He brings forth the herbage from the flocks and sees that each god receives his sacrifices. All that depends on him is a precious incense. He spreads himself over Egypt, filling the granaries, renewing the marketplaces, watching over the goods of the unhappy. He is prosperous to the height of all desires. Without fatiguing himself, therefore, he brings again his lordly ship. He is not sculpted in stone, in the statues crowned with the cobra. He cannot be contemplated. No servant has he, no bearers of offerings. He is not enticed by incantations. None knows the place where he dwells. None discovers his retreat by the power of a written spell. No dwelling is there which may contain you. None penetrates within your heart. Your young men, your children applaud you and render unto you royal homage. Stable are your decrees for Egypt, before your servants of the north. He stops the flow of the water for all eyes and watches over the increase of his own goods. Where misery existed, joy manifests itself. All beasts rejoice. The children of Sebek, the sons of Neath, the cycle of the gods which dwells in him, are prosperous. No more reservoirs for watering the fields. He makes mankind valiant, enriching some, bestowing his love on others. None commands at the same time as himself. He creates the offerings without the aid of Neath, making mankind for himself with multiform care. A festive song is raised to you on the harp, with the accompaniment of the hand. Your young men and your children acclaim you and prepare their long exercises. You are the august ornament of the earth, letting your ship advance before men, lifting up the heart of women in labor and loving the multitude of the flocks. When you shine in the royal city, the rich man is satisfied with good things. The poor man even disdains the lotus. All that is produced is the choicest. All the plants exist for your children. If you have refused to grant nourishment, the dwelling is silent, devoid of all that is good. The country falls exhausted. Men exalt him like the cycle of the gods. They dread him who creates the heat, even him who has made his son the universal master, in order to give prosperity to Egypt. Come and prosper, O Nile, come and prosper. O you who make men to live through the flocks, and his flocks through his orchards, come and prosper. Come, O Nile, come and prosper. So, flipping back to the questions. In the poem, the Nile River is definitely personified, if not deified. List some of the strong verbs, at least 6 of them associated with the Nile, found in the first 4 paragraphs of the hymn. And so we see there are lots of strong verbs in the first 4 paragraphs here. There is issuing forth, and descends, and create, and bring forth. We'll actually circle it down here instead of up there. There is torments, and shines, and brings, and spreads, and filling, and renewing, and watching. And so you can write down any of those things, as long as you have about 6 of them. Question number 2 says, list some of the titles given the Nile in paragraphs 1 and 2. And so we see the Nile is called inexhaustible, and path that descends from the sky, and lord of the fish, and chief of provisioning, and creator of all good things, and master of energy. And so we'll add some of those titles too. Number 3 asks, what happens when the Nile does not rise? And so we see a few things happening when the Nile does not rise. All that exists is in anguish, the faces of men waste away, the flocks are tormented, and the great and the small are in agony. So we'll go ahead and add anguish, wasting away, torment, and agony. Number 4 asks, what happens when the Nile does rise?
And so we see that many things happen when the Nile rises. Offerings are made, herbage is brought forth, the gods receive sacrifices, the granaries are filled, and marketplaces are renewed. And so let's go ahead and fill some of that in. Offerings are made, herbage grows, sacrifices, granaries are filled, and the marketplaces are renewed. Question number 5 asks, what are some of the responses of men and gods?
And so we see many things happen when the Nile does rise. A festive song is raised, children acclaim the Nile, rich men are satisfied, and poor men disregard the lotus. Lotus roots were something that poor people ate in order to keep themselves alive. And so when the Nile rises and we have plenty of grain, even the poor people don't have to stoop to eating lotus roots. And so we'll get those filled in. Festive song, men and women acclaim you, they make speeches, in other words, about you. Rich men are satisfied, and poor men disregard the lotus. This week you'll be reading other examples of Egyptian literature. Of course, as your teacher, it's my hope that you enjoy reading some of it at least. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.